Hi everyone. This week we have a pretty complicated topic, and I know the readings are not as easy to digest as in other weeks. So I want to walk you through the ideas of identity and voice in second language writing. What is voice? Voice is the imprint of the writer on the page. That's what Spandell says. It is the heart, soul, and breath of the writing. And Tompkins talks about this in her book. Another definition is from Ivanich. Ivanich goes a little beyond it, and she's saying that voice is not only individual or personal, but our choices of how to express ourselves can indicate something about our belonging in social groups. So she defines voice as the culturally recognizable ways with words that align a speaker or writer with one social group rather than another. And in her article with Camps, in Ivanich and Camps, they say that voice types locate their users culturally and historically. In other words, voice types indicate something about the speaker or writer's cultural background and historical context. In the sample mini lessons for today, they explain how to teach voice, traditionally viewed voice, to children. And this is for a fourth grade level. And so when they talk about how to explain voice to these elementary age students, they say explain to students that when they write, their personality or who they are should shine through. So what you would say to the students is, you want your writing to sound like you and no one else. When you write, you show who you are through words. No matter what type of writing you do, always make sure it sounds like you. Otherwise, your reader may not care about what you have to say. In fact, your reader may not even know who wrote it. So let's think about this a little further with some examples. What are some types of voice in writing? If you look at these different characters, I think most of us are familiar with Christopher Robin and Winnie the Pooh, and the owl, who's a professorly type, and Eeyore, who always seems to be grumpy and a little bit depressed. How would each of these writers sound in their writing? What kinds of things would they talk about? How would they talk about? What kind of words would they use? What kind of feeling would they have in their writing? You can imagine all different kinds of voice that people could write with. Professorly voice, or bookish voice, or funny voice, inspirational, sales type voice, or with it types. In other words, like young and hip people, casual, angry, skeptical, or other types of voice that people could impart in their writing. The thing is, how do we know when we're hearing or reading a certain type of voice? How do we recognize it? How do we know someone sounds like the funny type or the sales type? What kinds of language, rhetoric, or other types of signals are they using to make these voice types come through? And that's what you want to think about when you're teaching students. Are they sounding like themselves? Are they sounding the way that they want to sound, or are they just sounding the way that other people sound when they write, or the way that they think they're supposed to sound when they write? Ivanich and Kamps talk about some more specific voices that writers could use and what they call ventriloquate, which is basically what people do when they're using a puppet, right? They're ventriloquating. And the reason they say ventriloquate is because sometimes we borrow ways of doing things in order to sound a certain way. We borrow it from other people. So, like an environmentally aware voice, imagine someone who's writing like that. Or the progressive educator type voice, a sexist voice, a positivist voice, a self-assured voice. All these different types of voices can come through in our writing, and many more, obviously, or combinations of these. So how do writers do this? How do writers convey voice in writing? Well, Tompkins talks about 4 different ways that writers um, convey voice. One is through the topics that they choose. What we write about says something about who we are. Or through the way that they convey their passion. So our stances toward a topic says something about who we are. Writing with knowledge, the things that we know about really well, the things we're really sure about, and the things we express certainty about, our expertise, that says something about who we are. And adopting a specific tone, how you pitch the information with humor versus gravity, or witty or positive or sarcastic, all of those ways of pitching the information says something about who you are. Think of your friends on social media. Many people on social media try to convey a particular persona in the way that they post. What are they doing to convey that persona? Is it through what they post about? Sometimes. Is it the type of passion that they express or the way that they express their energy and their commitment? Is it through the things that they show that they really know about? Through their humor or their wit? How do your friends on social media convey their persona? Now, you might think academic writing is a type of voice. And actually, there are many types of voice in academic writing. And Ivanich claims that even though teachers often claim that academic writing should be impersonal, like objective, never use I and we, never use you, there's actually no such thing as impersonal writing. Academic writers use a range of different voices to convey messages about themselves, right? They try to look really expert, or they try to look very educated, or self-assured. They might try to show that they know how to write this genre really well, or that they know a lot about the topic. Ivanich and Camps talk about some of the particular ways that academic writers convey voice. So one example is pronoun use. The way we use pronouns can convey different things about who we are. And just one example of that is, for example, how do we convey generic reference? Do we do he/she, or the S in parentheses with she? How do we try to use gender neutral language? Or do we try to use it? So using he as a generic he, like mankind has always known blah blah blah, whatever. Using that kind of language, people who are more feminist these days are like, it's not cool to use that. We've got to include the she. But someone who doesn't do that is either showing that they don't really know about that critique of using the he as a generic pronoun, or they're resisting it. So they're showing us something about who they are. Nominalization is another example. Nominalization is when you turn a verb into a noun. So like instead of saying, we went to the store, the nominalization of that would be going to the store, or the trip to the store. So you turn we went to the store into a noun, right? Or a noun phrase. It's called nominalization. But it turns an activity, we went to the store, into a process, like our trip to the store. So the way that you talk about things can emphasize different aspects of that thing. By turning it into a noun, you kind of take out the people who are responsible, or the responsibility, and it makes things less visible. So just think of the difference between Operation Desert Storm. It's completely a nominalization. It doesn't specify the time. It doesn't specify the people who were responsible, or the people who were affected, or who was being invaded. A middle ground is like the invasion of Iraq. So At least it shows who's being invaded in that case, but it's still treated as a process rather than an action. And finally, the verb phrase version of it is the U.S. invaded Iraq. So that is not nominalized. It's a verb phrase, and it does show who did what to whom. Subject, action, verb. Subject, action, object. There are other ways of indicating voice in writing that Ivanich and Kemp talks about. There's many, many ways. Some is like the way you define a term or decide not to define it, the way that you cite others' work or treat yourself as the key authority, the types of visual features in the text that you use. There's many, many ways that you can show your voice and different types of voices in writing. So what are some of the challenges for second language writers in particular? And when we think about academic language and really displaying your voice in academic language, Schleppegrell talks about how academic language is a particular type of language that is organized in patterns that are different from spoken language or informal language. And so grammatical choices that may be good for informal interaction are not always effective for school-based or academic tasks. So it's a whole new set of language, a whole new way of communicating that even native speakers need to learn. And different selections from words and grammar in the language result in different kinds of spoken and written text that are valued differently. So, like for example, I've heard professors complain if students write to them and say, "Hey, how's it going? So, you want to hang out this week?" Haha, just kidding. Like if a student writes to a professor that way, it's a little awkward, it's a little strange. It's not as highly valued by professors for students to write to them like that. So their different ways of talking are valued differently in different contexts. So to write your friend like that would sound really cool. And it would sound, like you're being friendly and close with them. I'm going to talk about Hinkle's research because Hinkle wrote a whole book about academic writing amongst second language learners and the specific challenge that they faced in writing advanced academic texts. So she really looked at advanced second language writers and examined a lot of texts, really like a huge amount of texts, to look at some trends in what second language writers versus native speakers do. And again, these are advanced second language writers. We're talking about people who are getting the dissertation stage, right? So they're very good at their second language. But she says things like the nouns that they tend to use are less precise and specific. So they're using more general terms or more common nouns. Overusing features of informal speech. Using vague pronouns like anything or something. And having a hard time expressing subtleties in their convictions. So they might write, "Parents always encourage their children," instead of something like, "Parents tend to encourage their children," or something like that. So the specific ways of using language and more subtle ways of using like pronouns and expressing subtle convictions can be a challenge for second language writers. In particular, Schleppegrell talks about field, tenor, and the textual function of language, mode. So, and this is similar to what Ivanich and Camps talk about as well. So field is the ideational meta function, that thing about presenting ideas, and it involves content words that describe what is being talked about. They could be describing participants, processes, or circumstances. So nouns, adverbs, adjectives, verbs, prepositional, anything that describes what they're talking about. And in terms of presenting ideas, Hinkle, going back to Hinkle now, found that presenting ideas was difficult, so using those specific concrete nouns rather than vague and general nouns. Exploiting noun phrases to be descriptive with adjective choice. So a lot of second language writers would tend to say the dog was black versus the black hound, something like that. Exploiting more descriptive adjectives can be difficult. So the black dog versus the charcoal-hued hound. And using more varied and effective adverbials to describe place, time, and manner. So using, for example, just the more simple before versus during that era. So all of these are like that second language writers need a lot more specific vocabulary. So they need to build their vocabulary and really get into more specific and concrete and particular words. In terms of tenor, Schleppegirl points out that this part is about taking a stance or showing who you are. So any language that expresses identity, emotion, certainty, evaluation, and a lot of it is modals like would, could, should, and adverbs. So what do second language writers struggle with in tenor or taking a stance? One thing is using more formal academic registers, so a lot of versus to a higher degree, for example. Choosing more effective pronouns for persuasion. So, for example, saying, you should donate now versus those who are interested in helping can donate now, which is the second one is more academic. Expressing subtle stances through modal verbs and adverbs such as should, could, probably, and certainly can be a challenge for second language writers. And expressing, again, more subtle evaluation and attitude. So, for example, a second language writer would tend to say, parents always encourage their children versus, for the most part, parents tend to encourage their children. And finally, we have mode. Mode is the way that we structure a text and using language that structures the text, such as cohesive devices, conjunctions, connectors, clause combining, and thematic organization. And again, going back to Hinkle's study, she found that some of the things that second language writers in particular struggle with was to use varied sentence structures and clause combining so that there's a range of different sentence types. And using nominalization effectively to create a more smoothly flowing text. So the thematic structure and sentence fluency is something that can be worked on. And that goes back also to those adjectives where the second language writers tended to use something like the dog was black versus the black dog. The black dog can allow writers to incorporate more information into a sentence. More sophisticated ways of creating cohesion and connectivity within the text. So all those things that connect different ideas and tie ideas together can be especially challenging even for advanced second language writers. And engaging effectively in the mode. So, differentiating what you might say in speech versus what you might say in writing. And an example, just today I was talking to someone who used besides a lot. Besides is something we say in speaking a great deal, but we don't use that connector as much in writing. So that's more of a spoken way of expressing something. Thanks for listening, you guys. I hope this was helpful.